few months to go before the calendar would turn 2000, as a revived syncretic subculture was going haywire about what this event of Roman timekeeping might just mean. A book was published from within the field of alternative Egyptology that somewhat deviated from the narrative put forward in the bestsellers of the new renegades and the pyramid idiots that had conquered much of the 90s to gradually build up the craze. It was called The Stargate Conspiracy, and the authors Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince tells us in the intro to the book that, quote, as non-academics researching ancient Egypt, we could not remain unaware of the upsurge of interest in the alternative Egypt of Andrew Collins, Colin Wilson, and others, whose books challenged the often rather complacent certainties of mainstream Egyptology. Above all, three authors have become associated in the public mind with radical new ideas about ancient cultures, particularly Egypt. Robert Temple, author of the seminal The Serious Mystery from 1976. Robert Bauval, co-author with Adrian Gilbert of the Orion Mystery, 1994. And Graham Hancock, whose runaway success was established with The Sign and the Seal in 92. Since then, Hancock has gone on to entrance huge audiences worldwide with Fingerprints of the Gods in 95, and with his wife Santa Faya, Heaven's Mirror 98, and also collaborating with Robert Bauval to produce Keeper of Genesis in 96, and together with John Grisby, The Mars Mystery 98. These books encompass a vast range of fascinating and radical new ideas, many of which have now become so entrenched among their readers as to be accepted as hard fact. And, like most of their readers, we too began as enthralled admirers. After many months of researching and writing this book, we still admired those authors' energy and commitment. But as we stood back from their work, we have perceived a new and considerably larger pattern taking shape. Whether or not those authors are aware of it, their work forms an intrinsic part of what amounts to an orchestrated campaign. And the matter does not end there. The bitter controversy surrounding the idea of a long-dead civilization on Mars has also been absorbed into this campaign, and, like the mysteries of Egypt, has been pressed into service to present a carefully staged, managed message. Essentially, it proposes that the ancient gods were extraterrestrials, and they're back. But the subtext is very clever. Only certain chosen people hear their words, and only certain chosen people will be part of the revelations to come. We can hazard a guess at the identity of some of the chosen, but the others may be rather surprising. Cynically exploiting our end-of-the-century hunger for signs and wonders and our ongoing love affair with the mysteries of ancient Egypt, the conspirators are in the process of creating a massive, insidious belief system that feeds on millennium fever, though perhaps not blossoming properly until the very first years of the 21st century.
I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
Okay. So, yes. So Reid, you said you read a little bit about Robert Temple's The Serious Mystery. Personally, I only have, being a 90s kids, I only got it from Hancock and Bauval and the others of like the what they call the new orthodoxy of fringe Egyptology. But it does seem to be that the Serious Mystery is very much like a seminal text in this tradition. Do you want to say something maybe about like your experience with this book, but before I give like a little bit like a short rundown of what it's meant to tell us?
For sure. So, I like you, I'm a '90s kid, and I came to the Serious Mystery well after I had left my misguided and wayward, um, ufology obsessed, trying to do magic, kind of hippie youth.
Right.
And I came to Robert Temple first through a really good book that he wrote on the uses and abuses of hypnosis called Open to Suggestion, which is a really very, very paranoid, but pretty well documented and fairly well argued examination of hypnosis as a tool of crime and also like medical abuse by hypnotherapists and psychiatrists, psychologists. Really, really interesting book. And then I found out that he's written all this other stuff, like the Serious Mystery, that is just way off on the other side of the deep end. So like you point out, I've only flipped through it. But the significance of the Serious Mystery, at least in sort of in my mind, is in the impact that it's had on popularizing Sirius mythology and the position of Sirius and the notion of ancient aliens or modern aliens from Sirius as a cornerstone of some of the fringe bestsellers that came after it, particularly
Right.
People associated with Robert Anton Wilson and sort of more specifically in my wheelhouse, James Shelby Downard. So the mythology of Sirius really features prominently in both Robert Anton Wilson, other Discordians as well, and in Downard's supposed writing. And a lot of that is due to Robert Temple popularizing that notion of contact between non-human intelligences from Sirius and the Dogon tribe.
Right. Yeah. I mean, he really does seem to. I mean, he's quoted a lot, like by like anybody who gets into this field seems to say something about, like you say, the Dogon. And so, like the Dogon, I read the Conversations with Ogotomeli, an introduction to Dogon religious ideas, and this is like a small text from 1948. I found it like on a I have it like a state sponsored, like, well, no, it's not even state sponsored. It's an actual state agency in Sweden that like it has everything that's ever been recorded on an audiobook, like in Swedish. And so it even has like old cassettes where it's like it's telling you now it's time to change the cassette, and in the beginning of the audiobook it's like telling you don't listen to the cassette telling you to don't listen to the message telling you to change the cassettes, because this is a digital audiobook. And it's just like I'm like, okay, I'm in the right crowd here, like this is my kind of stuff. And so I didn't listen to all of it, like the Conversations with Diogo Temelli, and I don't think it is the first text that brings this up about the Serious Mystery, but it's not the one that I think Robert Temple like leans on, heavily. There is like a more, I think they did in the 50s, a more elaborate sort of rewriting of what they had gained from talking to this Ogotomeli. And so basically Ogotomeli was a seer or a shaman in the Dogon tribe, and they are a West African group, right? Like an indigenous sort of hunter-gatherer society, maybe doing a little bit of like natural farming, somewhat sedentary by the time that they interview them. It seems like from the way they talk about it, they have granaries and stuff. So they must have had some sort of, I don't know necessarily when it is that it's being suggested, how far back the theories about Sirius that they have, like how far back it goes. But like what's interesting about it is that, well, first off, Sirius is like it's like one of the closest stars, right? It's only like 9 light years away from Earth, and it's the second closest star to our own solar system. And so these two French anthropologists, Marcel Criaul and Germain Dietelin, they studied the Dogon for many years, and they like lived with them, and little by little they got more and more like initiated into their teachings. They were allowed to talk to people who even the Dogon don't allow everybody to talk to. And what they noted was this curious feature, right? That the Dogon believed that the Sirius star was accompanied by another star of incredible heaviness, which was invisible, like it is invisible to the naked eye. And they called it Pu-Tolo, the Pu star. And, Pu in their language means tiny seed of a type of cereal known as fonio. I don't know really what that means, but it aptly encapsulates the smallness of this star. And later, like in Western astronomy, it was in fact discovered, and it is now known that Sirius is a binary star system, and that the bright star we can see from Earth has a companion, which is again invisible to the naked eye, or indeed to any but the most powerful telescopes. And the existence of Sirius B as the companion star, it was only suspected by astronomers in the first decades of the 19th century, when anomalies in Sirius movements suggested the gravitational pull of a massive celestial body nearby. And it wasn't, conclusively observed until 1842, and not photographed until 1970. So, this is, of course, what opens up the mystery about the Sirius, right? Like, how can it be that these hunter-gatherers later turned into sort of pastoral agriculturalists? How can it be that they already knew that Sirius had a twin star, right? That seems to be the kick, right? The Kickstarter of this.
Yeah, that's the sort of the nugget that Robert Temple seizes on, and then kind of spins off into everything else that he elaborates.
Yeah, and he does elaborate a lot, I guess. Like, we'll get to that in a short while. I also really want to get back to what you were talking about, like the initial book that you read. I didn't know that he had written about the suggestion, right? Like about hypnosis. And I've been thinking a lot about hypnosis and remote viewing in this last, few weeks in preparation for this. So we definitely have to, we have to talk about that, a little bit later on. But I think, so the first interesting thing, maybe then, on another level of interest, is that even it is interesting what he's saying about the Dogon. Like, it is interesting that how can they know that there is a dwarf star connected to Sirius? But the other aspect is that Temple's book attracted the attention of not only the American but also the British security services, as well as the Freemasons. And in 1968, when Temple decided that he wanted to study the mystery further, a man called Arthur M. Young, who we will talk a lot about, provided him with a privately made translation of these two French anthropologists' books called Renard Palais. This was sort of one of those summarizing books of the conversations with Ogotomeli, and it became their main work on the Dogon, like their final magnum opus, sort of. And so Temple tells us how this copy was stolen from him in London by someone whom he later learned worked for the CIA. And so, presumably in an attempt to interfere with his research, or at least that's his own take, right? But the question still remains, right? Like, why would the CIA care about a book about the Dogon? It's just, it seems like not fringe archaeology, even. It's like fringe anthropology. Not in that they're doing fringe, they're not suggesting very outlandish things. They're just, sort of recapturing what the Dogon are saying. But it's a very, it's a very fringe subject in terms of just general scientific anthropological interest. And so why would they care about it? And so after being harassed by the CIA, an agency which Temple, admires, the plot thickens even further when it is realized that not only, American intelligence agencies were taking an interest in the book, but Temple also discovered that one of the British security service had actually commissioned a report on it, and that the MI5 had carried out security checks on him. And so Temple also relates how he was approached then by a prominent American Freemason, Charles E. Weber, who was an old friend of his family and who had been working in, he had been a high-ranking Freemason for generations, and discovering that Temple had discovered this book, he asked him to become a Mason. And he said the following, quote, "We are very interested in your book, The Serious Mystery. We realize you have written this without any knowledge of the traditions of Masonry, and you may not be aware of this, but you have made some discoveries which relates to the most central traditions at a high level, including some things that none of us ever knew." All right, so the reason for this might be explained later as not having, anything to do with the revelations performed by Temple or the Freemasons, or that there is necessarily something dangerous about the book, or that it contains, quote unquote, forbidden knowledge, but rather, this is at least is my theory. I haven't, I assume that you have somewhat a similar take, that rather, what made the intelligence apparatus interested in this and the Masons is that, the very person who gave him the book was this Arthur M. Young, a man with possible information about why the intelligence apparatus were suddenly interested with Temple and the way he had, revived for the counterculture this areo-heroic storytelling of the secret societies. And, to explain why that is the case, we need to go back a little bit in time, so this book is released in the 70s. But if we go back just a little bit in time, we arrive, at the heydays of like what is all of our favorites, the topics of all topics, obviously. And it's Project Artichoke and later the MK Ultra sub projects 58 and 136, just to, mention two, where we come across a man called Alan Moore, who was a deception and polygraph expert promoted to serve as the director of the Project Artichoke in 1952. It was Morse Allen's job to search the globe for the most potent drugs in existence so that the agency could exploit them for intelligence use. And this, what he called the quest for God's flesh, this was the initial name of the project, was so named after a particular psychoactive fungi upheld as supernatural in old Aztec myths. And Allen told his program officers in a rare surviving Project Artichoke memo, quote, "In some cases, Teonanactal, an Aztec god, right? Apparently endowed man, or this is God's flesh, yeah? Apparently endowed man with the power of divination, the ability to access information about the future or the unknown. In other men, the mushroom acted like a truth serum and made them confess to things against their better judgment or free will. The literature shows that witch doctors or divinators use some types of mushrooms to produce confessions or to locate stolen objects or to predict the future," Morse Allen wrote. So he's writing this in this memo. Then, we note that the Aztec, this Aztec mythological project of God's flesh was renamed MK Ultra Sub Project 58. And in the beginning, 2 years passed without success. And then, in the late summer of 1954, Morse Allen learned that an army captain at the Army Chemical Center, one of the CIA's military partners in MK Ultra, was also on the hunt for the hallucinogenic mushroom said to endow men with divinatory powers. Or, we will assume that they were in it for the truth serum aspect, right? And his name was Henry Carroll Andriaja Puharish. Do you think I got that name right? It's roughly
when Jimmy and I recorded an episode about star seeds, we went back and forth on how to say Puharic. There's no getting it right, so you nailed it as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, yeah, that's good. But Puharish it's Puharish. Then we have to get to him in a little while, because first we want to know about this guy Alan Moore, right? Well, and even before we learn about Alan Moore, I think, connecting to what I was already sort of putting forward in the first episode, which was leading up to this, it is of course very interesting that Alan, working for the CIA, should kickstart Operation Artichoke by seeking information in Aztec myths,
since indeed more than a decade before the funding of the Ahnenerbe, this is also how the fringe archaeology of the Nazis began, when Edmund Kiss in the 20s went to Bolivia to look for Aztlan, which is an Aztec myth about a prehistoric homeland which Kiss believed was to be found in Tiwanaku. And I mean, obviously, we know, right, like that the Aztecs weren't living in Bolivia, like that's Inca territory, if anything. But you know, the Ahnenerbe science is not the most rigorous, right? And so it seems also maybe not the project Artichoke, right? Like they're not really in it, you know, for the sake of historical accuracy, but you know that they find something interesting worth spending money on in terms of expeditions, and you know that they are targeting the exact same thing is of course interesting, because you know even though we will return to Edmund Kiss later and find out in what way he has also taught Hancock you know what to focus on, we know that this focus in general on plants for human experiments, in this case it's a fungi, a very exotic fungi, well this also happens to mirror exactly what the Ahnenerbe project were doing. So I think the most famous person here is like Heinz Brücher, and somebody wrote to me about him on Discord for the first time. I didn't even know about him when I did my first research about the Ahnenerbe. I knew what he was up to, but I didn't know him by name. And he was the institute leader of the plant genetics projects within the Ahnenerbe. And so the Ahnenerbe had already begun some exotic and domestic plant experiments at research stations in and around some of the largest concentration camps, such as Auschwitz and Dachau, etc. And there, research could be brought, you know, to a more extreme level by the human test subjects to measure and monitor the results on the human body and the mind. And as with many of the people, like, you know, we often talk about like how Nazis are often rehabilitated, right? But I think it seems to me, like just you know from my preliminary research, that that frequency is really, really high when it comes to the people involved in the Ahnenerbe. And Brücher, he is no exception, because he would, you know, not only survive and escape trial, he would also later work for the UNESCO after the war, when he was rehabilitated by the Swedish Academia and Sven Hedin. Sven Hedin, by the way, was like, you know, like a Tibet explorer, and actually like one of the biggest research departments within the Ahnenerbe was called the Sven Hedin department, which is just fucking crazy. And you know, Sven Hedin doesn't get any shit for this in Sweden. Like he's still considered a bit of a hero, you know, because he's such a famous, you know, I think 80,000 people saw him coming back to Gothenburg, like in the harbor, when he returned like from one of his big Tibet expeditions. There might also be connections to the State Institute of Racial Biology in Uppsala, one of the third or the fourth biggest cities, the fourth biggest city, I think, in Sweden, you know, because that Racial Biology Institute was operating from 1922 to 1958, and it was only later renamed into the State Institute for Human Genetics. And there are similar things, you know, this is basically what Brücher is working for with the UNESCO as well. Like we see that these expeditions, you know, like with the Ahnenerbe, I didn't bring it up in the last episode so much, but you know, we see also with the Deutsche Tibet Expedition, the 1938-1939 exploration of Tibet by Schäfer. Well, this, you know, this is also an expedition which brought back packets of seeds containing, and this is crazy, really, like 1,600 varieties of barley, 700 varieties of wheat, and 700 varieties of oats. And you know, this is not to mention hundreds of seeds from other potentially useful plants that they thought, you know, this is obviously for like war, like more normal war commodity stockpiling. Like it doesn't necessarily relate to psychoactive plants, like, well, the ones I mentioned, but we know that they collect a little bit of everything. And in connection to this, another thing that what, you know, Brücker, the man who would later work for UNESCO, another thing that he was involved in was the Operation Sammelkommando, which was, you know, the designated plundering of the Soviet research facilities of their seed and gene banks, something I once, you know, hinted at that I would talk about eventually in a forthcoming episode. But I don't know, that's sort of that's the backdrop. Like before we get into like the Stargate conspiracy proper, I think that is the this is where things begin, like in the 50s with the Project Artichoke, and we can see that there is some kind of connection, both mythologically, or rather like their interest of mythology is the same. They go towards the same places to discover, whatever truths, in this case, truth serum, which of course is interesting to the intelligence apparatuses. It's a naive understanding of the consciousness, but that, then, they're in it for other things. They're not really in it for helping people. So, and so, yeah, just initially, we'll get into more like connections between the Ahnenerbe and the CIA and the Stargate conspiracy, but that is the initial sort of connection. Do you have anything like that you would like to add to this? Or do you feel like this is a good start off?
One thing that I'll just comment on now, before we come back to it much later, is the idea of the instrumental usefulness of somebody like Robert Temple, to or Arthur Young, to the intelligence agencies, or societies with secrets like the Freemasons.
Yeah,
Part of it is just purely, I think, the power of suggestion that books can wield over readers. And Robert Temple,
definitely.
writing a book on the power of suggestion itself, is certainly well aware of that fact. You can. I tend to think a lot of things are hypnosis these days. Podcasts certainly could be hypnosis. Books can be hypnosis. But the sort of reaching back into the past to try to find some kind of instrumentally useful secret requires its own power of suggestion and suspension of disbelief on the part of the explorer, certainly on the part of the funding agency. But it has a way of sort of like creating its own solution, in kind of brute forcing some, like you said, naive sort of truth serum fungi that can kind of sort of fit the mythological bastardization that you've created. But that's just one thing that I was thinking about.
Yeah, no, I fundamentally agree. I think like if anything, like if there's any way to sort of put forward this story in a way that it would make sense to us, is to understand that even though it seems so spontaneous, even though it seems so independent, right? Like, why do people like Hancock, for example? Oh, they always say, oh, because he is, an independent archaeologist, and he really does the footwork, and he really goes to these places, and suggesting that armchair academics, who do have an opinion about these things, have never even been to like the Giza pyramids, for example. And that's true. Like, that guy Sherman, right? Michael Sherman. He has a lot of things to say about the Giza pyramids, yet he has never even been there. And so that's a powerful argument to make in favor of Hancock. But I think like what we will see is that so much of this is not really about any hands-on archaeological work. It's rather they are opening up, they are pushing the discourse into territories where things that should be talked about in a very different way, especially hypnosis. Like I yesterday night, rather than looking at the pyramid code, I just had to go back to like Lacan and see what Lacan says about hypnosis. And I think you'll like what he says later, because even in comparison with Picknett and Prince, there he is saying some interesting things about it. And these things should not all be designated to a sort of area of like, oh, we don't know everything, and it's a bit wishy-washy, but it's entertaining and it's interesting. And it's like, no, it's not only that. It is also something very real, something that have even military use. It's dangerous stuff in the sense that people can actually do. I'll get to Lacan's explanation later, but it's not only for the New Agers. These aren't things you can't equate the power of hypnosis with something like Christology or whatever they call it. Like that, it's not on the same level of effect, of social effectivity. And I mean, even Crystal is interesting in that sense, like how you can create a narrative that makes people believe more in something like homeopathy and like source, like really minute traces of crystal elements, and what that might do for you in your bloodstream and things like that. Like, it all ties into a bigger sort of, I wouldn't say necessarily only anti-scientific, because that seems like it's only like the credibility of science which is on the line. But there are plenty of things that they can perform by simply talking about these things in a way that, maybe they should not be talked about. Yeah.
No, it's very much not an anti-science perspective, even if the sort of aesthetics can take that form. Because as you pointed out on the last episode, a lot of the alt history, even the Ahnenerbe era stuff, uses the conventions of academic language to make its arguments, and tries to take that sort of scientific tone to appeal to that, because it's still very much sort of appealing to that cult of scientism and of measurement. It's just saying no. The way that science really works is in Atlantis you could levitate pyramids using crystals. It's still science, but it's Aryan science.
Yeah. Right. Have any of you ever watched The Triumph of the Will? Like, have you watched it like all the way through, like the whole thing?
No, I watched parts of it in I had a secular bar mitzvah when I was a kid, and we had to do a lot of Jewish history lessons, and we watched some Nazi films for part of that. So I saw part of Triumph of the Will, but not the whole thing.
That couldn't have been like a good party, mood setter.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
To watch. Well, it wasn't the bar mitzvah ceremony itself. That was the class. That I had to go to. When on the actual day of, we did a different thing. But
how about you, Colin? Did you ever watch?
I have not. I've seen bits and pieces of it, but never, all the way through.
Like, there's one really interesting thing, like you would assume, seeing as even Hitler like sort of favored the Eisweltlehre, the world ice theory, which we will get to later, like, because it pops up so much in so much of this stuff, and so you would imagine that there'd be like a great sort of like, proclamation about why the Eisweltlehre is correct. But if you look at like, Triumph of the Will, what it's actually doing is it doesn't even mention Höbige or the Eisweltlehre. It simply points towards the fact that Einstein, whom they refer to as the Relativitätsjude Einstein, like as if, there is something inherently Jewish about thinking in terms of relativity, which is fucking far out, man. Like as if, like, if there's any religion which, puts as much emphasis on an absolute, meaning organizing signifier in terms of like Yahweh, it's probably the Jews, right? Like, but in the Triumph of the Will, it's as if like the whole Jewish project is one of relativization, almost a critique of like postmodernism. And it's so interesting that they associate Einstein in the very next, that it cuts to a picture of Charlie Chaplin, right? And so they're making basically a critique that, Einstein is a pop Scientologist, maybe something that, we would even do, as a critique of, Carl Sagan or what's his name? What's the black dude who's
Neil deGrasse Tyson,
or that Japanese guy? Yeah. Neil deGrasse Tyson. What was the American Japanese guy? The futurist. Many people. Yeah. And like that is probably like an argument that we would say, like, oh, these are like, Musk poster idiots who just read whatever, pop science is coming out, like this isn't real science. It's like sort of, science made to fit your already existing worldview. And they are doing the same thing in the Triumph of the Will when they are talking about Einstein, and equating him with the fame of Charlie Chaplin. And they're asking the audience of the movie, basically, wie war das möglich? How is this possible, that like so many thousands of people came to see Charlie Chaplin, like when he arrived in Berlin or whatever. This is a cultural problem that people are being led to believe these pop scientific theories. And it's really fucking clever, because then you're like, okay, so if the special theory of relativity is not true, what else is there? And then, even though they have not mentioned the Eisweltlehre in the film, you're going to end up there eventually because, like, that's the biggest counterpart to it. But I mean, yeah, this is just some commentary on like the general power of like narrative, technique or rhetoric technique as to sort of conquer, I guess, what Foucault called the episteme, right? Like that which is allowed to be spoken of as science, right? Like not necessarily what science itself speaks about, but what is really allowed to be considered science. And so, this is the frontier of what, even though it might seem that they're fringe, I would say in this sense they are very much at the center of fighting over this. Right. So what is being put forward in the book as well, then very much at the center of this, creating a separate narrative, a narrative not based in scientific research, because remember, like the Eisfeldlehre, the Herbiger is explicitly saying, like proudly, like this is not something you can bring up and be like, oh, you didn't do the maths correctly. No. Herbiger is already saying in his documents that this was an inspiration. This is science derived from intuition, because mathematics fails in this regard, and it cannot produce the ultimate knowledge. Which again, yes, I would agree. Sometimes there are things which there are even ideological aspects about mathematics. There are some things that mathematics cannot really explain, and there are some things which mathematics tries to explain, but it cannot avoid the fact that it has to talk about maths in a social language, which is, soaked in symbolic meaning, and, just try to talk about the zero, try to talk about zero and not sound a little bit ideological. It's almost impossible, right? But Herbiger, takes this for granted from, from the get-go, and simply says proudly that I didn't do any research, in the regular scientific sense to prove the Eisfeldlehre, but this is what I came up with, and so we can tell, like that there's something. It's more than just the shift of one theory conquering another theory. It's also a shift in terms of like how do we accept what are the standards of why we accept one theory over another, let's say. All right, so that this brings us then the round table foundation and the lab 9, the very central to what we're going to talk about, which are 3 big topics, which is the 9, which is I'll tell you in a short while what the 9 are. And there's also the Egypt-Mars circuit. And then there's the third topic, which is the high strangeness in Giza, right? And so those 3 stories, they're the foundation of the Stargate conspiracy, right? That in the way that Prince and Picknett tells us the story. And so the round table foundation then, later called Lab 9, what was it? And what does it have to do with what we already put forward, introductory in ways of Operation Artichoke and MK Ultra Sub-Project 58 and 136. What does it have to do with that? Well, the Roundtable Foundation, later to be called the Lab 9, was a 1950s séance group headed by Puharish, and it's centered on a hypothesis of extraterrestrial contact with the 9 Egyptian gods of Heliopolis. Now, many of the 9's most devoted followers, lest we think that this is, just the workings of the Ghost Club in the 19th century, which, by the way, also involved physicists. Here, it is even more the case because the majority or substantial part of the devoted followers of this were physicists. And some of them, which I don't know how much it is emphasized in the book, but I've been talking to you guys in the Twitter, we've been messaging each other. What made me interested in this is that so many of them are also connected to nuclear research in general. Like it can be for supposedly merely like energetic reasons, and some of them definitely within the capacity of the military-industrial complex. So, for reference, if I want to pinpoint this point, then according to Saul Paul Sirag, who was a member of the Fundamental Physics group, I'm saying it like in a German way now because this is not the way to spell fundamental, right? In English, is it? Fundamental Physics
No,
group.
it's a deliberate misspelling.
Yeah, this is the German way to spell it, or like the Germanic. This is how you would spell it in Swedish exactly. Fundamental Physics group, which emerged from the which, I mean, again, yeah, you say it's a deliberate misspelling, yeah? Like, I mean, okay, so why are they misspelling it in German is what I'm also wondering. It's, and then Physik, right? Fundamental Physik. They don't even write the PH, yeah. Which emerged from, and this is the interesting thing then, this is a sort of like a very central master signifier to the whole like suit new age movement, like the more well equipped intellectually parts of the new age movement, which is a kind of quantum mysticism, which emerges in the 70s, but we already see the trace of it earlier in the 50s. And according to him, Saul Paul Sirag, who was a member of this group, 100 scientists, I mean, it's a pretty round number, and take this with a grain of salt. He says that in the US alone, 100 scientists believe they were in telepathic contact with extraterrestrials, which, I mean, yeah, that's a pretty left side of the brain argument for saying that this is something to pay attention to. And the Roundtable Foundation, not only that, but it also ran on very old American money and intelligence apparatuses funding it, etc. It has especially close connections to the Army's psychological warfare program. The Roundtable Foundation itself was, in other words, not quite the independent paranormal research center that Puharish implied. And so it also received, if we're going to take one example, it received the support from one very influential person. This was Henry Wallace, born 1888 to 1965. He was the former vice president of the United States. I think it's Truman, right? Am I remember? No? Who was Wallace? Should have put that in there, but you are of the new
He
world.
was vice president to FDR.
FDR, okay, yeah.
Yeah, he was briefly commerce secretary after that.
Yeah, right. And so he gave substantial grants to this foundation through his own Wallace Fund. I mean, it's not like he's trying to cover his tracks or anything. The Wallace Fund paid for a lot of the early works of the Roundtable Foundation. And so even before we get to Arthur Young, right, who we already mentioned, and indeed even before we get into who Puharish is, the only thing we said about him so far is that its name is hard to pronounce. Well, Henry Wallace, and I think it's a good place to start because Henry Wallace already is giving us some vibes about like where this whole project is going as a whole. In my opinion, I think this is what I've gathered so far. He was a devout fundamentalist Christian. And Wallace believed that God had chosen America to be the leader of the world, and that his own place in the scheme of things was hardly that of a humble foot soldier for Christ. As Dwight MacDonald wrote in his 1948 biography of Wallace, quote, just as he thinks of America as the nation destined by God to lead the world, so Wallace thinks of himself as a Messiah, an instrument through whom God will guide America onward and upward. End of quote. So very hyperbolic already. Then Wallace was also deeply interested in mysticism and spiritualism, and he was a prominent Freemason. And he wrote himself in 1934, quote, it will take a more definite recognition of the grand architect of the universe before the apex stone, again, this is the capstone of the pyramid of the US Great Seal, is finally fitted into place, and this nation in the full strength of its power is in position to assume leadership among the nations in inaugurating, quote unquote, the new order of the ages, end of quote. And as P. Picknett and Prince points out, in fact, Wallace, as Secretary of State for Agriculture in the 1930s, was responsible for the Great Seal, the Masonic symbol of the eye in the pyramid, the Eye of Providence, being incorporated into the design of the American dollar bills. And Wallace was a follower of the esoteric. Well, actually, I want to say something about, the American dollar bill first, because I already, in one episode, I took that dazed and confused comment where Slater's son, when they're smoking on the car, and he's like, you ever taken a look at a dollar bill, man? There's some crazy shit going on with the dollar bill, man. And it's true. There are some crazy things on it. But my point is that this is the guy who's the Secretary of State of Agriculture. And anybody who's paid attention to my show knows that I really like it when agriculture gets involved. And I really didn't expect to see this at the very beginning of this. I mean, we already mentioned about stealing seeds for, war commodity purposes under the disguise of doing fringe archaeology. But now here's Wallace as well as Secretary of State of Agriculture. And I don't know. I just felt I had to say something about that. Do you think there's something to that? You ever taken a look at a dollar bill, man?
Oh, there's certainly no end to symbolism there. No, I think Wallace had a broad interest in not just agricultural science, but he was into everything. He was actually close friends with one of the Iranian kingpins that helped supply the Manhattan Project, a guy named Boris Pregel. Boris Pregel was Russian originally. And Wallace conducted radiation experiments on the Wallace family farm, where they were trying all sorts of strange sort of mid-century harebrained schemes to, they would use irradiated water on hydroponic tomatoes to see if that would help the tomatoes grow better. Or they'd give the chickens radioactive feed.
Right. Yeah. Right. Wasn't it in Jimmy's Discord feed? Sovereign's, Anarche. He always changes his name, so it's hard to keep track. Sovereign Balloon, maybe it was one of his most recent. I don't know what title it goes under now, but he was saying, how there is how the sweet corn was made in this way. That they just they grew corn next to sort of like the Manhattan Project testing sites to see what the radioactivity would do to the corn. And apparently it turned it sweet. Have you heard about that?
No, that's wild.
Yeah, that's fucking crazy. Every time now I have corn and it tastes sweet, I'm like, this is atom bomb Oppenheimer corn, man. Like, we should not be eating this.
That's really, really wild. I think I hope nobody ate whatever Boris Pregel and Henry Wallace were cooking up, because they were really trying. They were swinging for the fences. But it worked out with sweet corn. So what do I know?
Yeah, and isn't it the case that Wallace, this what I read now is the narrative provided by PNP, but what I knew about Wallace was that what didn't he try to start a third way sort of it seemed to me almost as if he had read what the Comintern were saying in the 30s about the need to create a party that was neither socialist nor communist, but which was a sort of broader front organization of workers and farmers, and that there was an attempt around this time in the 30s and the 40s to create such a party in the US, and that he tried to infiltrate it. I mean, that's at least my take, but when you read conservative authors from the time, like American conservative authors, they're saying that, you know, Wallace is in bed with the communists and he was always waiting for the communists to tell him what was up, and then he would sort of enact it. Have you gotten into this part of like Wallace history? I really couldn't make sense of it, to be honest. Like I didn't get it. What was his deal?
He was very strange. I don't remember if this was in the Stargate conspiracy, but I've read a lot that sort of he had as part of his very devout Christian but also mystical kind of faith, he saw a very special role for himself personally, in sort of bringing the kingdom of God on earth. So I think part of it was a little bit of megalomania on his part.
Mm-hmm.
But after he got ousted as Commerce Secretary, I think in 1946 or 47, then that's when he signed on to the Progressive Party, which was pretty short-lived.
Right, that's what it was called.
Yeah, it was pretty short-lived. But there had been other attempts to create sort of a third party in decades past, but I don't think they'd ever had someone of his stature sign on. But his politics got weird. I think the biggest thing that got him ousted, as you mentioned, he supported some kind of, or at least he suggested he supported some kind of international control over nuclear weapons, as opposed to having like an Atomic Energy Commission. You would have an International Atomic Energy Commission, but he backed away from that, I think, after he was pilloried in the press.
Yeah. Okay. Because I mean, where I stopped here in my notes about him is that, like, we also see another connection of this sort of flirting with communist ideas, or, I mean, this is another really strange thing. And I also said earlier that, like, I really want to make an episode about like Red Shambhala. Yeah, just I want to sort of create like a counter narrative to, you know, what we're going to talk about in these episodes. Like, you know, that there was also, it's not only the Americans and the Nazis who were interested in, like, you know, ancient history. The Soviets were also interested in it, and obviously, I mean, at least I believe that like the Soviets were like the first to also sort of really make good sci-fi as well, which isn't the grim Warhammer 40,000. It's only war, not that kind of like sci-fi. So like Red Shambhala, like Wallace, he was a follower of like this esoteric Buddhist mystic, Niklas Roerich. I'm saying it a little bit German now, but like Nikolai Roerich, a man with, at the time, an amply documented extreme hostility towards the Bolshevik movement. And he thought of communism as, quote, the impertinent monster that lies to humanity, end of quote. And Wallace sent this Nikolai on a special mission to Tibet and Outer Mongolia. And it's said because, you know, he was convinced that there would be evidence there of what you said, Reid, you know, that the second coming of Jesus Christ would be there. When I read Nikolai's accounts, it seems to be more about Maitreya, which is sort of like the Jesus figure in Buddhist eschatology. Like Maitreya is usually the Buddha to come, right? In China, they sort of make it easier, and it's just a laughing Buddha. So it's sort of like, don't be so fucking into it, man. Just laugh. Look at the depth of history and destiny itself and just laugh. And you are already Maitreya somehow. But this was maybe not really the conviction of Wallace or Nikolai. And I mean, this expedition was also, just like the Schäfer expedition, which we already touched upon, you know, the Tibetan expedition of the Ahnenerbe, this was one of industrial espionage and war preparation. It's so ridiculous. Like when you read the old papers, like I read some papers about this expedition, people in favor of Wallace doing this, and it's like they're almost. I mean, it's not like they're almost. They are literally. The narrative is that Wallace sent this expedition there to help the planes, like as if he's some early sort of UNESCO knight in shining armor who just decided that, like, oh, Japan's, like, I don't know, like how, it wasn't really occupied by Japan already, but like, I mean, they're already there. And that like Manchukuo is like, just happens to be the place where I want to bring Christian good wealth to. But we do know that, Nikolai, or the Roerich, there were two brothers actually, like I think his, or was it his son maybe? There were two Roerich on this expedition, and they did find or stole 300 species of drought-resistant plants in Inner Mongolia, and they collected like some 485 packets of seeds by the end of the expedition. And when I read some of the reports, they themselves even discuss that the major problem was that many of these seeds and many of these crops were already designated as war commodity material, which means that you can't just come there and pick it up and be like, yeah, we also want to have this. And they're like, no, this is things that belong to us. And obviously the impending invasion of Japan also problematized this expedition. But it's interesting that, like, on the side of Wallace being a founder of the Round Table expedition, the Round Table Foundation, he also has he's funding these kinds of expeditions, and obviously it also had intelligence gathering purposes. The same thing as the Schäfer expedition in Tibet. They wanted to find out, like, this is where the story gets sort of strange, and I'll only be able to really tell it when I get into the Red Shambhala. But it's said that Nikolai became almost like a double agent, and that he turned or converted to a more like Buddho-communistic conviction, and that they were organizing people in Inner Mongolia to sort of blend Buddhism with communism and see would these people over there, like, it's a pretty big part of the world, and it's a pretty like strategically important part of the world. Would they side with the Russians? Would they side with the Japanese? Or would they side with the Americans? Right? Like, I mean, it's an interesting sort of non-European melting pot place in the world. And obviously, like, Wallace was interested in this as well. Then in relation to this, not surprisingly, Wallace's political opponents, especially J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, he made great capital out of leaked letters from Wallace to Nikolai Roerich, which began, "Dear Guru." And so I agree with you, Reid, that I think that the reasons for him to resign was, the problems with the US policy regarding Russia and the atomic bomb. But Hoover seemed to have tried to like sort of frame it as like, this is an absolute nut job. He's got a Buddhist communist guru guiding him, which, I mean, it's going to get stranger as this story progresses. But like already from the get-go, it's an interesting character in the story, Mr. Wallace.
Absolutely. And I will say, Henry Wallace being a very complicated figure, he made Hoover's job very easy for him because he would respond to basically anybody. You can go through the Henry Wallace archive at the University of Iowa has a good correspondence archive because he was from Iowa originally. And he would respond to, or one of the secretaries would respond to basically anybody, including cranks as infamous as James Shelby Downard himself. He wrote letters to Wallace proposing various ideas for using radio waves to charge ions in the atmosphere to grow plants better. And Wallace passed these ideas along to his friend Boris Pregel. So Hoover had an easier time than with most political figures getting some embarrassing dirt on him, because he was just he loved to he would have been emailing all the time if he was alive today.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it would be like the Clinton emails, but
Exactly.
like even worse. Dear Guru, I've listened to your recent talks on Buddhist communism, and it really sounds like it's something we need for the Progressive Party in America. And you can just see like Hoover going fucking insane. It's like, this motherfucker.
PPS, I have attached 5 grams of uranium from my friend Boris Pregel. Try it on your petunias and see what happens.
Exactly. Like, have you ever tried the homeopathic approach to plutonium? Just have a little bit of radioactive water in the morning. You will see how it makes everything clearer. Yeah. All right. But I mean, Wallace doesn't play a very prominent role. I mean, I don't know. When does Wallace die? Like, he dies 70 something? Like, I mean, he gets ousted here over the whole nuclear thing, right? Like, so he's pretty early on, he's out of the picture,
Yeah, he
right?
he, he dies in 1965.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, yeah. So he can't have like an enduring importance to the story. But the first person to attract our attention and to attract the Stargate conspiracy's attention is, of course, Andrea Puharish. And so, who was Andrea Puharish? Well, he was an army medical doctor, a research scientist, a hypnotist, a psychedelic and trance state specialist. And he is the man who will become the leader of the Nine and later the Nine Lab. And of course, we already hinted at it, he has a pretty strange background even before he gets into this stuff. And so since 1947, Dr. Puharish, he had, a well-funded prize-winning staff of scientists, doctors, and technicians. And they've been conducting a wide range of unusual research at a privately funded facility called the Round Table Foundation, which was located in rural Maine. Puharish was also a long-time believer in mental phenomena, even claiming a personal childhood experience with telepathy, which keeps on popping up in this story. People being told things telepathically when they were children, which is strange. And when Captain Puharish was called in for a briefing by the army, it came to light that he knew more about magic, mystical, supernatural, and occult research than just about any other scientist living in the United States at the time. And Dr. Puharish was granted a high security clearance and briefed on classified Army Chemical Center efforts to locate drugs that could produce altered states and enhance psychic functioning. This took place then when he was stationed at the Army Chemical Center at Edgewood in the 50s, and it was collaborating already with a special program within the CIA's MKUltra project that aimed to find ways to, quote, program new memories into the minds of amnesiac subjects, end of quote. And his handler is, by most accounts, Alan Artichoke Moore from the intro, and his Godflesh operation. But another key figure in the MKUltra experiments, the one who we all know, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, head of the CIA's Technical Service Division, who personally supervised experiments in conjunction with the Army Chemical Center in 1953 when Puharish was working there. He was also the head of this division in 1972 when it gave Hal Puthoff of SRI, the Stanford Research Institute, the funds for his preliminary research into remote viewing. Like, this is still far away, like, from our chronology, but that Gottlieb has this sort of like reappearing connection to Puharish, and who might have been his handler within the army is of course interesting. It's nice to already sow some seeds of doubt about Puharish work. And he himself, Puharish, notes that the order for his redrafting into the army was issued the day after he briefed the Pentagon on the military uses of parapsychology in November 1952. Curiously enough, Puharish work with the Brazilian healer Artichoke in the 1960s seems to have been part of what is called the Essentia Research Associates projects that was sponsored by the NASA. And Puharish and wealthy businessman and former US Navy intelligence officer Henry Belk, they were both called to Brazil in 1963 to take a look at this guy, Artichoke. And Artichoke, by the way, is like, he was a Brazilian sort of seer, right? Like some kind of supernatural character, or like a character with supernatural powers. And they were called in by John Lawrence, an engineer working for RCA on NASA satellite projects. And he had in fact been part of the committee that originally established the space agency in 1958, referring to NASA then. And I don't know. Like, first off, of course, it's interesting. NASA is like one of the most respected ones. Like, I always, if I'm gonna pick like an American, an abbreviation apparatus that I'm like, yeah, I'll believe what you say because I have absolutely no power to create a counter narrative. Usually, it's NASA. I mean, we could talk about the moon landings and everything. I mean, there's gonna be so much about NASA in this episode as well because it's dealing with outer space, obviously. But that they're already in it this early on, and that NASA is funding projects to go to Brazil to find this Arigo is interesting, and that Poharish is involved in it. But even more interesting, I just remembered because like when I read this and I was like 1963, like that's interesting because that's exactly the same time when Jim Jones visits Brazil, which by many alleged to have similar purposes. Like he wanted to know about the Brazilian voodoo and stuff. And can't help to think that maybe Poharish and Jim Jones met in Brazil interviewing some shaman over there. I don't know. do you have any thoughts about that? Any of you?
Uh, who knows? Like the, everything with Jim Jones that goes on, it constantly surprising. So it would not surprise me.
If I'm remembering correctly, there's a British or a potential British intelligence connection to Arija as well. Tanner and my good buddy Tanner and buddy Jimmy, my good buddies Tanner and Jimmy, did an episode on the Ghost Watch BBC special,
Oh yeah.
and they got into a guy named Guy Leon Playfair, who, if I recall correctly, also was very interested in Arija.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I don't know much about him, but it's interesting that, like, of all things, Brazilian shamans pops up as like of the utmost interest to intelligence agencies and people with like cult aspirations in America. Like, what were they on to? Yeah. Right. So Poharish is also he's engaged. Like this list goes on. Like just setting the base of like who is Poharish. Like uh, he was engaged in some undefined work for the Atomic Energy Commission in 1968. Although it is known that he was working for the head of biophysics, Paul Henshaw, who led the American team that studied the effects of the Hiroshima atom bomb. And yeah, again, not only physicists involved in this, but like nuclear scientists of like the highest kind are like constantly orbiting Poharish throughout the story. And we mentioned already this Essentia Research Associates, which he was affiliated with when he went to Brazil to look for this shaman, right? And so, what is the Essentia Research Associates? It's already a creepy name. Like, I don't like people in general. Like, whenever I hear people talking about essentially something, blah, 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 it's usually pretty scary stuff. Like, it's this all encompassing and it's all this, it's like, and it's you tend to be very dualistic as well. Like, I have one of my favorite, like, nuclear scientists from Japan. He always does essence, substance, and phenomenon. So that there should always be, like, sort of three major constituents of the universe when you do approach the topic of the universe. But usually when these people do it, it's either essence or it's whatever you already thought, and the essence is always the most important. So what was the Essentia Research Associates then? Well, it undertook research into psychic abilities on behalf of government agencies such as the Pentagon, NASA, and the Atomic Energy Commission. Perhaps understandably, information about Essentia is hard to come by, but we do know that Poharish presented a paper on their behalf to the Pentagon as early as November 1952, entitled, quote, An Evaluation of the Possible Usefulness of Extrasensory Perception in Psychological Warfare, end of quote. This is very strange, for according to the official account, the Pentagon's interest in psychic abilities only began in the early 1970s, with the remote viewing experiments at SRI. Again, this is the Stanford Research Institute. Yet Poharish and Essentia were doing similar work for them at least 20 years earlier. Poharish's connections with Essentia continued until at least 1977. Before we go on, do you want to say something about this? essential research associates. I know it's already there's a lot to be unpacked here, but that it goes so far back that already in the 50s they were researching this, like right after the Second World War, basically. And his fucking title, An Evaluation of the Possible Usefulness of Extrasensory Perception in Psychological Warfare, it seems to be pretty on point. You don't have to do some Derridian discourse analysis to see what he is on about, this guy.
No, they were very open about open within the requisite security clearance with what they were looking into. My read on some of that stuff is it especially with NASA's interest in things like telepathy and extrasensory perception. This is something, as you mentioned, like there were plenty of physicists in the British Ghost Club in the 19th century, right? So anytime you're dealing with new notions of invisible forces and new physics, that coincides with scientific interest in the paranormal. And especially for an agency like NASA to be so reliant on things like telemetry and remote monitoring, in particular when it comes to the health of astronauts, right? They're the most fragile, the most sensitive, the most error-prone components of any space program. The ultimate dream would be to have perfect distance mind control of your astronauts, right? So their interest in ESP, to me, sort of, I read it in that sense. It's about kind of a moonshot program for your most sensitive component on a spaceship.
That's interesting, man. I never thought about that, but of course, turning them into sort of basically ham radios would be the that would be the best thing possible.
There's a paper, somehow. I'm trying to remember the year that it was published. It was either, I think it was 1968, so a little bit later. No, it was earlier. It was in the earlier 60s, maybe 1962. But it's the title is The Electronic Control of Astronaut Sleep. And it's a proposal doing a rundown of all these different ways that you could try to discipline the astronaut's sleep-wake cycle to the needs of the space program in the absence of any natural earthly stimulus, right? So you don't have the normal, day-night cycle. You don't have the natural feeling of gravity, right? So your sleep is all messed up. That's going to make the sensitive component of the astronaut all haywire. And it runs through hypnosis, drugs, Pavlovian conditioning. And then the end of the paper sort of ends with what the author proposes, which is, well, let's just implant a sensor that will sort of give a warning shock to the astronaut. Hey, you need to go to sleep now. And if you don't get into bed, I will make you sleep by triggering, the right part of the brain. That was really the goal that they had in mind.
Jesus. That sounds to me a lot like, I don't know if you've ever gotten into him, like Franco, like Spanish fascist Franco. He had a doctor who moved to the US. And I think like many people know him from, can't remember what his name is now, but like he had that famous, very Spanish movie with like a bull sort of racing straight towards the matador. And then he has implanted some brain implant, like an electrical brain implant, and he just stops the bull, mid attack. And the bull just doesn't run into the matador, and it just goes off to the side. And he wrote a paper about it called something like the psychoelectrical conditioning of civil society or something. I can't remember the exact title, but you can, the aspiration is clearly there, like, that we need to implant things to make psychosocial society less friction. Yeah. We needed to function with less friction, basically, like to the point where you can stop a bull mid attack against the matador.
Jose Delgado about? And the book title, I'm just getting this from Wikipedia. Physical Control of the Mind Toward a Psycho-Civilized Society.
Yeah.
Pretty chilling.
Psycho-civilized society, that's fucking chilling. Yeah, that's really terrible stuff. Especially when you're a Franco doctor, Like, that's so scary. Considering his, like, Christian overtones. Not just 1984, but it's like you're hearing voices in your head from the Bible once a week, just doing the catechesis. There's so many, like, weird ways you can spin off in just by reading the title of that paper. But yeah, I mean, it's really interesting that we will talk about, you know, what you just said about the interest of controlling astronauts in this way. That Puharish also had a corporation under his name called the Intellectron Corporation. And between 1958 and 1971, he was its research director, trying to sell these patented electronic devices for the treatment of deafness. And as early as 1947, Puharish, according to investigative journalist Stephen Levy, became interested in the study of paranormal abilities, quote, specifically in ways he could document them and perhaps enhance them by electronic means, end of quote. But he had another long-abiding interest in the use of electronic devices. Almost from the start of his career, he had been fascinated with the idea of using radio waves as a means of communicating directly with an individual, essentially by beaming thoughts straight into their brains. Soon after qualifying as a doctor, he became interested in the phenomenon by which an individual accidentally picks up radio transmissions, hearing them in their head, for example, through the fillings in their teeth. One of Puharish's close colleagues in this work was Warren S. McCulloch, the pioneer of cybernetics, whose work was funded in part by Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation, a known CIA conduit. In the late 1950s and 1960s, Puharish worked on various electrical and electronic techniques, ostensibly to enable the deaf or hearing impaired to hear again. Stuart Holroyd wrote that Puharish had devised an electrical deaf aid that conveyed the radio waves directly to the skin. Several of these admirable devices were patented by Puharish and have been successfully used in the treatment of deafness. More suggestive, however, is his invention of a miniaturized radio transmitter that could be hidden inside a tooth, which explains at least the reasoning behind the rather bizarre accusation that Uri Geller had such a device implanted in a tooth to somehow help in the creation of his paranormal phenomena. When Puharish electronic work is considered as a whole, it can be seen to be geared to the same end, to find ways to make people hear voices in their heads, remotely viewed images, I guess. This would have been particularly useful if trying to create a belief system based on mystical encounters with otherworldly beings in the form of auditory hallucinations. Yeah, that's the end of the part about this Puharish interest in the Intellectron Corporation. I mean, that sounds exactly what you just talked about, Reid. Like, but in a much darker sense, you know, like we're not trying to help astronauts. They're saying that it's to help deaf people as well, you know, which is a very, as they say, admirable cover. Like, I mean, they don't say cover, but this is an admirable endeavor. But we can see how this could be used for other reasons. And since we're going to get into like a little bit, I don't know where this first originated, but you know, since I'm part of like somewhat the same parasocial gang as you guys are, our whole thing with dentists and whatnot, this is fucking interesting. That you can put the radio transmitter inside a tooth. This is scary, man.
No, and there'll be more good dentist watch content later in as we get into the Stargate conspiracy book. But it's really really wild stuff. And I think in many ways, like you say, this is darker than sort of like ostensibly trying to help astronauts. The conditions that you are in if you're an astronaut are kind of ideal for being brainwashed, right? You're essentially in a sensory deprivation tank by default, right? There's no gravity,
Right.
natural light. You're totally disoriented. All the natural sensations you would rely on for getting your bearings are suspended, and you're totally at the mercy of the life support system, so to speak. And so part of the trick that the technologies that the Intellectron Corporation seem to have pioneered, especially when it comes to the kind of dual use hearing aid, voices in your head machine, is to find ways of replicating those conditions for people on Earth to sort of totally strip them of their bearings
Yeah.
or their
Yeah.
filling.
And it's so interesting, man, that you say that, because like I spent at least 3 train rides just trying to get into the mind of a captain on a nuclear atomic submarine. And I was thinking the exact same thing that you were saying now, you know, like how it is already a sensory deprivation tank, basically. I mean, I don't know really how, you know, those machines work, but I could imagine that, considering the, you know, how long lasting like an engine like that is, if you put that thing on autopilot and you just let it run until the plutonium is depleted, I mean, it's the Flying Dutchman times a million. Like it's just, it will go on and on and on and just ride around the oceans of this earth like some fucking, like you're not needed anymore. Like you just put it on cruise drive and then you're there. And like these people, they're in such an unnatural environment that like I would start believing whatever. Like I don't know, what would you start believing? And the, you know, the fact that there's so many of these people seem to be somehow connected to this. You know, why is it that the new age suits inspire so many of these people who we would think of as fairly rational beings? Like, I mean, you gotta be a rational being before you are allowed to, I don't know, maneuver a nuclear submarine. But like, even if you're on that nuclear submarine, how quick, or like, you know, how soon before your senses starts to erode to the point where you're basically like in a Tarkovsky movie. You're already starting to ask some pretty big questions about life, I would imagine. I've only been on a nuclear submarine once. I was on a Soviet nuclear submarine that was harbored in Sweden, maybe 19 years ago with my father. And I was on that thing for an hour. That already upset me very much. Like it felt like a different world, to be honest.
Yeah, I'd imagine it would be extremely isolating. And then the kind of psychological screening that you go through to be a submariner, I think it's pretty similar to what you go through to be an astronaut.
You look lonely. I can fix that.
All right, so here's my first point that I thought was interesting because I already knew about this before and I'd never picked up upon this. We're still on Puharish, but you guys know about the Vrillon incident, right? The live on ITV November 26, 1977, England, UK, hijacking of like public television incident. I don't know how to frame it, but do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, there's a
Yes.
similar. Well, what was the Colin? What's the? I'm blanking on the name, but there was one of these that happened in the States as well, where somebody interrupted a TV channel. The Max Headroom incident.
Yes, yeah, I was just thinking about that whenever you said
Yeah,
that.
so that's for probably a better known idea of signal jacking for the audience.
I don't know about that one actually. I never heard about that. Maybe that one is the Canadian American equivalent of this, because the Vrillon incident, like, pretty popular in Europe, I
Yeah,
think.
I don't remember too much of the background.
Can you tell me about
I
that?
don't remember too much off the top of my head, but it was the same idea of somebody hijacking a TV signal and they were wearing a weird mask. And Colin, do you know more about? I don't think it's nearly as interesting for our purposes as the Vrillon incident, but
Yeah, it's really not. It happened in Chicago. I had to look it up here really quick. 1987, but essentially it's a guy wearing a mask in front of like a corrugated steel background. And says a freaking things. Just says that the host is a freaking liberal. Talks about cans of Pepsi. It's a very odd thing. You can watch it online. It's like a minute long. And yeah, it's mainly just known as one of the best incidents, like you said, of signal jacking. It's not nearly as exciting as the British version, where there's a little bit more of an alien connection to it.
interestingly, I'm seeing on Wikipedia that the Max Headroom character, was actually originally a BBC character on Channel 4. So there is a UK connection there, but it like Colin said, the Max Headroom incident where somebody signal jacked wearing sort of the mask and doing the character shtick was in Chicago.
Okay. Yeah, I'm definitely gonna, like, when I edit this, I will put in the sound sample of the Vrillon incident because it's eerie.
The Rhodesian nationalist leader, Bishop Abel Muzorewa, has accepted Mr. Smith's offer to negotiate an internal settlement based on one man, one vote. But, he says, there are conditions. These include stopping the execution of all captured prisoners of war, allowing Giroux to take part in negotiations, being arrested. In Australia, Mr. Kerry Packer's cricketers are still pleased about yesterday's High Court decision, which lifts the ban on them playing in Test matches and county.
This is the voice of Allah, representative of the Ashtar Galactic Command, speaking to you. For many years you have seen us as lights in the stars. We speak to you now to say the same as we have done to your brothers and sisters all over this, your planet Earth. We come to warn you of the destiny of your race and your world, so that you may communicate to your fellow beings the course you must take to avoid the disaster which threatens your world and the beings on other worlds around you. This is in order that you may share in the Great Awakening as the planet passes into the new age of Aquarius. The new age will be a time of great peace and evolution for your race, but only your rulers are made aware of the evil forces that can overshadow their judgments.
So, yeah, to tell this story, right? So, on the evening of the 26th of November 1977, television broadcasts in part of southern England were interrupted by a voice claiming to be a representative of an extraterrestrial civilization, saying that they would be landing on Earth soon, in order to prevent mankind from destroying itself. Dismissed as a student prank, few have noticed that the short message actually did include this sentence, quote, "We conveyed to Sir John Whitmore and to Dr. Puharish that we would interfere on your radio and television communication system to relay when the civilization are coming close to landing on your planet." End of quote. Now, clearly this was intended to be a fulfillment of the first part of Tom's prophecy, and Tom is one of the names given by the the channelers of extraterrestrial messages by the Lab 9 or the Nine, and the hijacking of radio and TV broadcasts prior to the promised mass landing. And so, if this really were a student prank, it's odd that it should include a reference to Whitmore and Puharish, very influential people behind the scenes, and that such interference with television transmissions would, of course, require sophisticated equipment and technical expertise, leading some to conclude that the message really did come from extraterrestrials. However, as usual, there were only two diametrically opposed options considered at the time. One, either the whole thing was genuine and extraterrestrials had really spoken to the South in English through their television sets, or it was a hoax, just done for laugh. The idea that such a message could be easily contrived by, for example, an intelligence agency that would have the necessary technical skills has never, to our knowledge, even been considered, says PNP. And yeah, when I read that, I thought the same thing. You know, why is Vrillon, why is he talking about Puharish in his message? That's really odd.
Yeah, it's almost like the message was really kind of meant to be received specifically by members of the Nine cult, and it was just sort of the medium had to be a public television program to sort of make it seem more credible to the specific narrow audience. That's sort of my read on it. But I don't know. It's weird. It's almost like a kind of mass indoctrination kind of thing.
Yeah, it makes sense though, right? Like, wasn't Robert Temple's the Serious Mystery? Isn't it released in 1976, 1 year before this
That's right.
thing? Like, that's the first thing. That's the first time I would guess that the message of the Nine through this sort of fringe archaeological, fringe historical mass or bestseller reaches a wider audience. I mean, obviously, it's not like for everybody yet. It's for people who have read Temple in a way, I guess. Like if we want to narrow it down. But isn't that the case? I'm trying to go up here in the notes and see when.
Yeah,
this,
that's right. It was 76.
Yeah, that's freaky, man. Like, because for sure the name, then that's how you would know the name Poharish or Whitmore.
And one other kind of interesting thing about that is, they mentioned, saving the Earth from itself. That's become a very common thing within, aliens and kind of the old history sphere. Is that humanity is going to destroy itself, and these aliens that come down and gave us the pyramids and everything, they are also going to save us from nuclear disaster or what have you, that we're too kind of incompetent or bloodlustful or whatever to save ourselves. We'll destroy ourselves. So they're here to save us. Kind of reinforcing that idea as well.
Right. It's like the intervention.
Exactly.
It's like it's how they say in the anthem, the music anthem, right? Like calling all occupants. Please, only a landing will teach them, right? Please, interstellar policeman. I can't remember the lyrics perfectly, but yeah, it really has that vibe, right?
Yeah, kind of not really a Space Brothers vibe, but more of a we're here to stop you from destroying yourselves, which that is a
Right.
very big theme within the New Age kind of UFO contactee, a subset of that community.
It's very misanthropic in a way that mankind cannot take care of itself and that they need this intervention. And to be frank, most of my favorite UFO stories are usually about those kinds of things. When they have visited, well, supposedly nuclear stations, and we'll get to one really interesting incident later. But also, in the movie Phenomenon, I'm sure both of you watched it, like was it an elementary school in South Africa, right? That was, all the kids basically said that they had seen a UFO, and that some kids were talking to the aliens, and it was the same message again, that we're coming here to help you not destroy yourself in nuclear war or climate catastrophe, etc., etc.
Yeah, it's definitely the repeated message that we hear these days. It's almost like it's sort of perfectly calibrated too, for kind of the right wing conspiracy culture to sort of pin this as, oh, this is the woke globalist blue beam message of they want us to disarm and to get rid of all our nuclear weapons and give them up to China. But then on the other hand, it sort of has that kind of more hippie, liberal friendly message as well. So you kind of get sort of both sides sort of polarized in that way.
Yeah, especially China is going to pop up. Like I even have some reference to China in the Phenomenon film later. But maybe we should get to Arthur M. Young.
And that, dear listeners, is where we will have to cut for today. This episode became a bit of a cold open because we messed up and lost some 30 minutes of meet and greet intro. You will get a more formal greeting from our guest eventually, and unless I get abducted, you will hear from the three of us again in 2 weeks' time, or maybe even a bit earlier, since I took some time to get this one out. I spent 3 weeks and many whole afternoons in the office putting together a script, and we got through just about a quarter, which in turn became 2 episodes. So hopefully this will be a very mysterious autumn, with some of the wildest tales from the world of ufology and ancient aliens. Thank you so much for supporting this project. You are fantastic. Please stick around to check out the show with a glassy eye, looking at the sun dancing through the sky. I'm serious, dear listener. Did they come by a UFO? Oh.
Shaking like a leaf on the desert heat. His daddy's got a bag that's so hard to beat. I bought me a ticket, got a front row seat. I'm checking out the show with a glassy eye, looking at the sun dancing through the sky. Did he come by UFO? A lot of tricks are pulled in the book I read. Only man I know that got up from the dead. A lot of people living by the words that he said. I'm checking out the show with a glassy eye, looking at the sun dancing through the sky. Did he come by UFO? Think he'll ever come again a different way? Maybe he is coming while I was away. Too much goodness is a sin today. I'm checking out the show with a glassy eye, looking at the sun dancing through the sky. Did he come by UFO? There is something happening that isn't too clear, just a little different than a previous year. I think the happiness is getting very near. I'm checking out the show with a glassy eye, looking at the sun dancing through the sky. Did he come